What if everything you thought you knew about Ukraine came from a single chapter of its story? Imagine a nation entirely within Europe, yet larger than France. A land where powerful cities were already rising while much of medieval Europe was still finding its footing. A place so rich in natural wealth that empires crossed continents, not only to conquer its people, but to claim the very earth beneath their feet. This is Ukraine. Step beyond the headlines, beyond the maps and political debates, and another picture begins to emerge. A vast country shaped by wild landscapes, ancient civilizations, and a spirit that has survived for more than 1,000 years. Paragraph. From the snow-covered peaks of the western mountains to the endless grasslands stretching across the east, Ukraine unfolds on a scale that feels almost impossible. And beneath those fields lies one of the greatest natural treasures on earth, its legendary black soil. Deep, fertile, and extraordinarily rich, this land has sustained generations. For centuries, seas of wheat and endless rows of sunflowers have turned these plains into one of the world's great agricultural heartlands, feeding millions far beyond its borders. Ukraine is not simply a land of old monuments and forgotten ruins. It is a living landscape built on endurance. But to understand a country this vast, you first have to find its heartbeat. That heartbeat is the Dnipro River. Flowing for more than 1,000 miles through the center of the nation, the Dnipro has always been more than a river. It was the ancient highway of Eastern Europe. More than 1,000 years ago, Viking traders sailed these waters, carrying furs and amber southward and returning with silver, silk, and ideas that connected distant worlds. Along one of its great bends, surrounded by forested hills, a remarkable city took shape. Kyiv. Often called the mother of cities, it became the center of a powerful medieval state known as Kyivan Rus. By the 11th century, while many famous European capitals were still developing, Kyiv had already become a thriving metropolis of stone churches, golden domes, and bustling trade. At the heart of that legacy stands St. Sophia Cathedral. For nearly 1,000 years, its golden rooftops have reflected the morning sun. Inside, ancient mosaics have watched history unfold as invading armies, collapsing empires, and changing generations passed through the city. Locals have long called one of those sacred images the unbreakable wall, and perhaps no symbol could describe Ukraine more perfectly, because through centuries of conflict and change, this land has carried a single idea across generations, that roots planted deeply enough can survive almost anything. But the soul of Kyiv is not found only in the monuments that rise above the skyline. Part of its story lies hidden beneath the ground. Just south of the city center stands one of the oldest spiritual landmarks in Eastern Europe, the Kyiv-Pechersk Lavra, often called the Cave Monastery. For centuries, pilgrims have descended into its narrow, candlelit passages, walking through a silent underground maze where the preserved remains of monks and saints still rest. In the darkness below, history feels untouched by time. That instinct to build beneath the earth, to seek protection and preserve what matters most, became part of the city's identity. Even today, modern Kyiv carries that tradition. Far below its busy streets lies Arsenalna metro station, one of the deepest subway stations ever built. Descending hundreds of feet underground, it was designed with survival in mind. Yet, what makes it remarkable is not its depth, but the life that continues within it. When danger reaches the streets above, the underground does not become a place of panic. It becomes part of the city itself. People gather, musicians perform, small businesses reopen, art finds its way into shelters, carved from concrete and stone. Daily life refuses to disappear. It is a powerful reminder that resilience is not only about rebuilding after disaster. Sometimes, resilience means refusing to stop living at all. And if Kyiv represents the deep roots of Ukraine, then the vast southern steppe reveals its untamed spirit. Follow the Dnipro River south, beyond the old rapids, and the landscape changes almost instantly. The forests begin to fade, the horizon stretches farther and farther until the land seems to merge with the sky. Waves of tall grass roll endlessly across the plains, moving with the wind like a green ocean. At the center of this wilderness stands Khortytsia Island, a rugged outcrop of stone rising from the river currents. For generations, this frontier became a refuge for people who refused to live under the rule of distant empires and powerful landlords. Runaways, adventurers, and free spirits escaped to these open lands and forged a new way of life. They became known as the Cossacks. More than a military force, they were a self-governing brotherhood built on the idea that no man was born to rule another. They chose their own leaders and made decisions together, creating a society unlike almost anything around them. In 1710, one of their exiled leaders, Pylp Orlik, drafted a political charter that many historians consider one of the earliest constitutional documents in Europe. Long before many modern democracies took shape, it proposed limits on government power, divided authority, and defended the rights of free people. The man who wrote it would spend the rest of his life in exile. But the idea survived. It became another thread woven into the long story of a nation that believed freedom was something earned, protected, and passed from one generation to the next. The Cossacks left behind more than stories of battle and politics. They created a culture that celebrated identity, tradition, and the simple act of belonging. Around open campfires on the Great Steppe, families prepared a hearty dish known as kulish, a thick millet porridge slowly cooked in iron pots beneath the night sky. It was humble food, but it carried the spirit of a people who had learned to survive in a harsh and unpredictable world. Their celebrations were equally unforgettable. Warriors trained through fast-paced martial exercises that gradually evolved into a breathtaking folk dance filled with spinning jumps, high kicks, and gravity-defying acrobatics. What looks today like pure celebration was once a form of combat training, preserving the skills that generations depended on for survival. Even their clothing held deeper meaning. The traditional embroidered shirt, known as the vyshyvanka, was never considered just another garment. Every pattern, every geometric symbol, and every carefully stitched line carried beliefs passed down from ancestors long before the arrival of Christianity. For many, wearing it was believed to offer protection, a reminder of home, family, and the generations that came before. The same ancient symbolism appears in the intricate decorated eggs known as pisanki. Created through a delicate wax-resist technique, these colorful designs are filled with suns, endless lines, and sacred patterns that have been handed down from grandparents to children. For centuries, they are not simply decorations. They are stories preserved through art. Together, these traditions formed the invisible foundation of a nation. A people who believed they did not need permission to exist. And when powerful empires eventually tried to erase that identity, banning the language, restricting local customs, and attempting to rewrite history, the spirit of the culture did not disappear. It simply found a safer place to live. It moved into the home. Across the countryside, surrounded by orchards of apple and cherry trees, stand the traditional, whitewashed cottages that have become symbols of rural Ukraine. With their thatched roofs and painted shutters, they appear peaceful, almost untouched by history. But those quiet homes became strongholds of cultural survival. When schools could no longer teach the language and books were no longer allowed to print it, families became the guardians of memory. The kitchen became the nation's most secure refuge. Here, tradition survived not through official records, but through recipes. In a pot of deep red borscht, generations preserved more than a meal. Each family carried its own version, rarely written down, carefully memorized, and passed from mother to daughter. The ingredients might change from one village to another, but every bowl carried the taste of a shared past. Songs and lullabies protected what laws tried to erase. Children learned words that could not be spoken freely in public. Grandparents passed down stories that never appeared in official histories. The people with the least political power often became the keepers of the longest memories. No one understood that quiet resistance better than the poet Taras Shevchenko. Born into serfdom and legally owned by a landlord, he eventually gained his freedom and made a choice that changed history. Instead of writing in the language of the ruling elite, he wrote in the language spoken by ordinary villagers. His poetry gave a voice to millions. The authorities immediately recognized its power. He was arrested, exiled to the distant shores of the Caspian region, and personally forbidden by the Tsar from writing or painting. But even exile could not silence him. For years, he secretly continued his work, hiding his writings wherever he could, determined that his words would survive. They did. His collection of poetry outlived the empire that tried to destroy it. The language endured, the people endured, and far beyond the open plains, another chapter of Ukraine's story was waiting in the mountains of the west. As the endless plains fade into the distance, the landscape begins to change. The open horizon gives way to rising hills, and those hills climb steadily toward the dark green heights of the Carpathian mountains. Here, Ukraine reveals one of its oldest and wildest faces. Massive forests spread across the western frontier, wrapping the mountains in mist and shadow. At their heart stands Mount Hovola, the country's highest peak, where storm clouds drift across. the ridges and the modern world seems to disappear below. In these remote valleys, Europe still holds on to something it has almost entirely lost. Primeval wilderness. Ancient beech and spruce forests blanket the slopes, many of them protected as UNESCO heritage sites. Some of these towering trees have stood for more than 3 centuries, their roots buried beneath thick carpets of emerald moss, untouched by generations of loggers. Nature dominates this landscape, and when humanity leaves its mark, the forest often reclaims it. One of the most famous examples is a quiet railway line where branches have slowly intertwined above the tracks, creating a living tunnel of green that seems pulled from a fairy tale. Known as the Tunnel of Love, it is a reminder that time moves differently in these mountains. But the forests are more than beautiful. They are one of Europe's last great sanctuaries for wildlife. The elusive Eurasian lynx move silently through the high ridges, often leaving behind nothing but tracks in fresh snow. Deep among the trees roams the European bison, a magnificent survivor of the ice age that was once driven to the edge of extinction. Even the forest floor hides rare wonders. After heavy rain, a striking blue slug appears among the fallen leaves, a species found in very few places on Earth. And somewhere beyond the valleys, hidden among the endless timber, walks the brown bear. The Carpathian support one of the largest wild bear populations in Europe. Most people who live in these mountains will never see one, but the bear is always aware of them. For centuries, these rugged highlands have also been home to the Hutsuls, a mountain people, whose lives have been shaped by altitude, isolation, and the changing seasons. Their traditions reflect the demands of the land. One of their best-known dishes is banoche, a rich meal of cornmeal, sour cream, and smoked sheep's cheese, slowly prepared over an open fire. It is simple food, created for long winters and hard mountain life. Yet these mountains have always carried an air of mystery. Local legends speak of ancient healers and weather readers who understood the language of herbs, storms, and forests. According to old beliefs, these mountain shamans quietly passed their knowledge from one generation to the next, keeping alive customs far older than written history. Eventually, the mountains begin to soften, the forests thin out, stone roads replace woodland paths, and beyond the foothills appears a city unlike any other in the country. A place shaped not by one empire, but by several. Welcome to Lviv. Its historic center feels unmistakably Central European. Renaissance buildings stand beside grand Baroque churches, while elegant boulevards reflect centuries of Habsburg influence. Walking through its streets, it would be easy to imagine you were somewhere in Austria or the Czech Republic, but Lviv belongs to a story entirely its own. For hundreds of years, control of the city shifted from one empire to another. Different rulers varied, different flags were raised, and different borders were drawn. Yet through every change, the city protected its identity. One of the clearest reminders of that history rests within the quiet pathways of Kyiv cemetery. Among weathered statues and old stone monuments lie the poets, soldiers, architects, and thinkers of different eras and different empires. The cemetery stands as a silent archive of all the worlds that once claimed this place. But above ground, Lviv is anything but silent. The city moves to a rhythm built around conversation, culture, and one tradition that has become almost legendary: coffee. According to local legend, a native son helped introduce coffee culture to this part of Europe centuries ago after the Ottoman Wars. Whether history or folklore, the story matches the spirit of the city itself. In hidden courtyards and underground cafes, coffee is not rushed. It is slowly heated, carefully prepared, and treated as a daily ritual. And in Lviv, even a simple cup of coffee can come with a secret. Behind unmarked doors and down narrow alleyways are hidden taverns inspired by the underground resistance movements of the past. Visitors may be asked for a password before stepping into spaces that playfully echo a much darker chapter of history. Because this city has always known how to protect what matters, and whenever danger has threatened the nation, Lviv has often become its vault, a place where priceless manuscripts, works of art, and cultural treasures are quietly sheltered for future generations. For to understand what Ukraine has fought to preserve, we must now leave the safety of the western hills and journey toward the vast golden plains of the east. Leaving the western cities behind, the landscape opens once again. The hills flatten into an endless horizon, and the earth transforms into a sea of gold. Across central and eastern Ukraine, millions of sunflowers stretch toward the sky, turning together to follow the summer sun.
Beneath them lies the same legendary black soil that has made this land one of the richest agricultural regions on the planet. It is a place of astonishing abundance. And yet, this fertile ground witnessed one of the darkest tragedies of the 20th century. In the early 1930s, the government that controlled the region launched a campaign to break the independence of the farming population. Unrealistic production quotas were imposed, and when villages could not meet them, officials confiscated everything they could find. Grain was taken, seeds were taken, even food hidden inside homes was seized. Then the borders were closed. Millions of people were left to starve on some of the most productive farmland on earth. The tragedy became known as the Holodomor, a famine that transformed the very land that had sustained generations into a weapon against its own people. But history offered little time to recover. Less than a decade later, another catastrophe unfolded. On the outskirts of Kyiv, the ravines of Babin Yar became the site of one of the Holocausts. Most horrific massacres, where tens of thousands of innocent lives were lost in an unimaginable act of violence. Farther south, another community faced a different kind of destruction. The Crimean Tatars, an indigenous people with centuries of history tied to the Black Sea coast, were forced from their homeland. Families were loaded onto trains and deported thousands of miles away in an attempt to erase an entire culture from the land it had called home. Yet even after people were displaced, another battle remained. The battle over memory itself. For generations, the history of Ukraine had been carried not only in books, but in music. Traveling musicians known as kobzars wandered from village to village performing ancient epics with a traditional instrument called the bandura. Many were blind, and their songs preserved stories that had survived for centuries.
They were the living archives of the nation. In the 1930s, authorities understood the danger of a people who remembered their own past. According to one of the most enduring accounts of that era, hundreds of these musicians were gathered under the promise of a cultural event only to disappear forever. Their instruments were destroyed, and their voices were meant to be forgotten. The silence was supposed to last, but memory does not disappear so easily. An instrument can be burned, a book can be banned, a monument can be torn down, but a song can travel from one generation to another. In secret, the bandura was built again. Old melodies were whispered inside homes and quietly taught to children who would wait decades to see an independent nation. Today, those same songs are heard once more in public squares and city streets. Empires have vanished, borders have changed, but the music endured. If the eastern plains tell a story of endurance, then the southern coast reveals an entirely different side of the country. Here, where the vast steppe meets the deep blue waters of the Black Sea, the air grows warmer, and the pace of life begins to slow. At the center of this coastline stands Odessa, built with grand boulevards, elegant neoclassical architecture, and the famous staircase. Descending toward the harbor, the city carries an unmistakable confidence. For centuries, merchants and travelers from many cultures passed through this port. Greeks, Italians, Jews, and Ukrainians all left their mark, creating one of the most cosmopolitan cities in the region. That mixture of cultures gave Odessa something else as well, a unique sense of humor and a love for life that has become part of its identity. The spirit of the city is reflected in its food, fresh fish from the Black Sea, family recipes passed down through generations, and influences gathered from distant shores all come together at seaside cafes where meals are meant to be shared, not rushed. But like so much of Ukraine, Odessa has another face. Beneath the elegant streets lies a hidden world. Originally carved to supply the limestone used to build the city above, an enormous network of underground passages gradually expanded into one of the largest catacomb systems on Earth. For centuries, these dark tunnels sheltered smugglers, resistance fighters, and countless secrets hidden from the world above. And yet, even these underground passages are only a small chapter in a much older story. Because hidden beneath the gentle hills of this region are caves of crystal and gypsum that stretch for hundreds of kilometers, many of them still being explored today. Long before those caves were mapped, long before Odessa existed, and long before the Cossacks rode across the steppe, ancient civilizations were already leaving their mark on this land. Long before modern borders existed, this land was already home to remarkable civilizations. Archaeologists have uncovered the remains of the Tripilian culture, a society that flourished here nearly 6,000 years ago. They built enormous circular settlements, crafted beautifully decorated pottery, and followed traditions that still puzzle historians today. One of their greatest mysteries was the strange cycle of destruction and renewal. Every few generations, entire communities appear to have deliberately burned their own settlements to the ground before building them again from the ashes. No one knows exactly why, and the deeper researchers dig, the older the story becomes. In the same region, scientists have discovered shelters dating back roughly 15,000 years, constructed from the skulls and tusks of Ice Age mammoths. They stand as astonishing reminders that human life has existed on this landscape since the end of the last great glacial period. Ukraine is a place where history is layered upon history. Each generation leaves its mark, and another rises above it. Perhaps nowhere is that cycle more visible than at a place about 60 miles north of Kyiv, a place whose name became known across the entire world. Chernobyl. For decades, the name has been associated with catastrophe, a symbol of nuclear disaster. A forbidden zone where entire communities vanished almost overnight. Walk through the abandoned city of Pripyat today, and it feels as though time simply stopped. An empty Ferris wheel still stands waiting for a celebration that never came. School books remain scattered across silent classrooms. Apartment buildings slowly surrender to wind and rain. The silence is almost overwhelming, but if you look carefully, another story begins to emerge. When people left, nature stayed, and nature did something extraordinary. It reclaimed the land. Trees forced their way through cracked roads and broken concrete. Forests spread across empty neighborhoods. The ruins that once symbolized destruction gradually became part of the wilderness itself. Then the wildlife returned. Today, the Chernobyl exclusion zone has become one of Europe's largest accidental wildlife sanctuaries. Wolves roam through abandoned orchards. Brown bears, absent from the region for generations, have returned. Moose wander through old waterways. And perhaps most remarkably, Brzezelski's horses, the last truly wild horses on Earth, were introduced as an experiment and adapted to life in the zone, creating thriving herds across the abandoned landscape. The place that many believed would remain lifeless for centuries became proof of nature's astonishing resilience. Yet the most powerful story in Chernobyl does not belong to the forests or the animals. It belongs to the people who refused to leave. After the evacuation, a small number of elderly residents quietly returned to their ancestral villages. They crossed military checkpoints and went back to the wooden homes where they had spent their lives. They planted gardens. They drew water from old wells. They lived among forests that were slowly filling with wildlife once again. These women, often called the self-settlers, made a choice that many outsiders struggled to understand. For them, home was worth more than fear. Ask why they returned, and the answer is often simple. A person cannot truly leave the place where their roots were planted. Their story reflects something that appears again and again throughout the history of this land. Like the forests reclaiming abandoned streets, like the wild horses running across empty fields, life always finds a way back. And when you step back to see the whole picture, a pattern begins to emerge. From the snowy peaks of the Carpathians, to the endless steppe, from the underground caves beneath Kyiv to the warm light of a family kitchen, every part of this country seems connected by a single idea. In Ukrainian, there is a word that captures it: volia. It is often translated as freedom, but it also carries the meaning of willpower, determination, and the unbreakable resolve to endure. Because here, freedom and the will to protect it have always existed together. You can see that spirit in one final tradition, the korovai, a ceremonial bread, carefully shaped by hand and decorated with patterns of wheat, birds, and symbols of prosperity. Preparing it is more than baking. It is an act of community. The dough is kneaded together, the bread is shared together, and even through the harshest winters, it carries a quiet promise that the harvest will return and no one should face hardship alone. For more than 1,000 years, kingdoms and empires have tried to reshape this land, silence its language, or erase its identity. None of them succeeded, because Ukraine is far more than the conflicts that dominate today's headlines. It is a country of ancient forests and endless plains dotted of hidden caves and golden fields, of songs that survived when books could not, of families who carried history from one generation to the next. It existed long before the world was watching, and whatever history brings next, its story will continue, because some places are built from stone, others are built from memory, and memory is far harder to conquer.